Thank you. All right, I'm lucky last, so I'll keep this relatively brief and hopefully somewhat interesting. So thank you for the opportunity to talk a bit on some of the work I do more in my day-to-day job as a power systems engineer in the grid connection world. So the first thing I'll start with is a little bit of an observation. An observation some of you may have noticed maybe in your travels throughout power systems engineering, and that is very early stage solar farms and wind farms seem to be suspiciously round numbers like 30 megawatts or 50 megawatts or 60 megawatts. It's almost like someone made that number up, or that was just a round number. Not many early stage projects that I've seen have a specific number, a 32 or a 79. So there's just something to keep in mind. Maybe question it the next time you see it. Now, I don't know how many people here are from a consulting background or have had this kind of situation, but they have a friend, a mate, a client that calls them and say, Damien, guess what? I found some land and I want to build a solar farm. And I want it to be as big as I can before I spend too much. You're like, well, what does that mean? So the purpose, and for example here I've got over my left shoulder an example that we're going to go through together to try and answer that question. So the whole point of this presentation is to share what I would do in response to that question. So of course what I do is present to you a well-orchestrated 5-step plan with lots of text, and I conclude my presentation. No, that's not what I'm going to do. No, I'm going to go through the 5 steps, and hopefully you'll have some interesting questions for me at the end. But in summary, these 5 steps behind me are increasing levels of complexity. You can do step 1 and stop. You could engage me to do step 5 all the way through and pay me a bunch of money, and they'll be fantastic as well. But I'm joking. Going to start with some important definitions. Now, I'm not going to try and bore you or think that you all don't know what you're talking about when I say the difference between megawatts and MVA. But there is an important and subtle distinction that can come up in modern terminology when we talk about a large solar or wind farm connection. So Pmax, or the total amount of registered capacity at the connection point, is one important number that comes up quite frequently in grid connection studies. The second number that comes up quite a lot is Smax. That's the total nameplate sum of all the inverters that are in a solar or wind farm, for example. Smax is normally typically larger than Pmax. Smaller generators, typically those less than 5 MVA, for a reason we'll see soon, that's some foreshadowing, are about the same. So in summary, both numbers are important, and we'll explain why. So first of all, we're going to start with the aptly named example town solar farm. It's almost like this was made up for the presentation on the fact it's exactly 100 hectares. I love it when engineering stuff works out the way you expect. And we've got this beautiful single line diagram, which I made up. So the square S is roughly where on the single line diagram example town solar farm sits. So the first step, if you remember those 5-step process, the first step we're going to start off with is how big of a renewable generator can I feasibly fit on there? For example, if we could fit 20 gigawatts worth of generation on the site, that probably won't be a limiting factor that we have to consider. So I've done some presentations and some studies before in my experience as a solar farm designer to look at, given X space, how big of a solar farm can you put on here? I've got the calculations there for a 32% ground coverage ratio. In summary, it's about 77 megawatts and about 85 MVA. And if you're interested as to what the difference between why you have megawatts and MVA different, there's a fantastic seed for a question afterwards, if you wish, or just catch me later. So essentially what that means is there's no point considering more than 77 megawatts as a limitation. This is like our starting factor. Now we start to think about constraints. The first one for step 2 is regulatory soft limits, which sounds as a strange thing. A soft limit is a strange way to describe something like that. But in summary, these are certain parts where me as a grid connection engineer starts to notice that the process becomes more complicated or more expensive. And the thing I hammer into my colleagues, having colleagues here, as well, is that 5 MVA. Don't go above 5 MVA. If you have to go above 5 MVA, go well above 5 MVA. Because the difference between the Chapter 5A connection process and the more scary Chapter 5 connection process is 5 MVA. It used to be 5 megawatts up until about 2 to 3 years ago, until there was a clarification from AEMO. I think that clarification was good because clarification makes the process easier. Go above 5 MVA, you have a bit of a free run until about 30 MVA, in which case it becomes a little bit more complicated. I've got a whole bunch of tick marks here for PSSC and PSGov models. If any developers in the room, that is just basically more and more cost. So there's a really good way to think about what I'm presenting on screen right now is money. That's also foreshadowing for potentially something I'll talk about later. So this could be the first step of the process, and I have had this with some clients. Damien, I want to do a 35 megawatt solar farm. All right, that'll be about $500,000 in studies. Okay, I want to do a 3 MVA solar farm. That's better, that's something we can do. But let's say we want to continue on the journey a bit more. There's a little bit of background we need to talk about here, which some of the presenters before me have touched on, which is system strength. Here's also a good seed for a future question. But as I think been mentioned at this conference quite a few times, grid following inverters require some level of synchronous fault level to remain synchronized. If there is insufficient fault level, they will not be able to remain synchronized. The rule of thumb, which is what industry normally uses, but was also certified or backed up in SIGRE Technical Brochure 671, is a minimum short circuit ratio of 3 at the terminals of an aggregated generator. For example, if I have a 10 MVA generator, I need 30 MVA of synchronous fault level under the minimum case for that to be stable. And yes, highly recommend the bedtime reading if you have not read SIGRE 671. Important definitions on this, or how to do this. To actually, obviously, you will need to do, we're going to start to get to the more studies perspective. I mean, this is going to be dividing 2 numbers by each other. It's a nice intro to some of the more studies we'll be doing. But normally what you would want to try and achieve in this is you could use PSSC, you could use some power system studies to find out what that minimum fault level is at your connection point, or you could ask your friendly neighbourhood NSP and they'd be more than happy to give you that information. So, importantly thing here, we also typically complete this under a system N-1 case, or the worst single outage which results in the lower system strength. Just because the network is designed to be N-1, so we should also be designed to be N-1. And remember, we're going to do this as a cost, so we're going to get to the cost eventually. So I've got a little calculation, I've got an extremely complicated calculation where I take 2 numbers and I divide them by each other and I get a number. So what I'm basically saying in this is for the 66 kV connection, which is connecting between substation A and C over here. And under system normal, at the 66 kV connection point, I have 191 MVA. I've got to take off a little bit if I'm doing it on the back of the envelope for the impedance and therefore the fault level drop over the transformer and the cabling, etc. So let's just, instead of doing 3, let's do 3.3. 191 divided by 3.3 gives me 58 MVA. So 58 MVA of inverters I could put in and have sufficient fault level. Of course, we're going to do N-1. Always going to worry about N-1. In this case, obviously, as you can imagine, if the network is running in a 1 level of redundancy below, we will have lower fault level. 155 divided by 3.3 gives us 47 MVA. So we can start to see, okay, you can fit 77 megawatts, 85 MVA in the land, but something happens at 47. And you can probably imagine from the previous speakers what you may need then for 47. So that's step 3. You could stop here. You could go, because just as foreshadowing hints, essentially what you will need is some form of system strength remediation, which unfortunately is commonly synchronous condensers. You could stop here. 47 might be your limit. 47 MVA, and you can go back to the end. Go back to the developer and say, hey, don't go above this limit. But let's continue out of interest of seeing how far we can take this. So let's go to the next level. Let's do some static studies. Then you can do it the easy way, which is the simple one, or we could do it the hard is probably not the right way, the more advanced way, which is step 4B, which I'm going to go through. I'll go through both of them in different levels of detail. So some considerations here. We've talked about how much can we fit in the land. We've talked about how much fault level we need to operate stably. We haven't talked at all about the poles and wires in the street, the transmission network. If we put 77 MVA into that, 77 megawatts into that network, will the lines just burst into flames? That's probably something we should check, because that will be a constraint on our design. So under system normal, system N, that's exactly as I described. Under an N-1, we could get a bit more cute with something like an end of trip or a run-back scheme to limit that overload. So here we go again. We're going to do the same thing again. I'm going to do the simplified version here. We're really interested in 2 different scenarios then for this local electrical network I'm looking at. It's the maximum coincident loading and the minimum coincident loading. Just to clarify what I mean by coincident, it is not the sum of each zone substation individual maximum, it's the maximum of the network. And the minimum, in this case, would normally be negative, especially because of the embedded generation. You can see, for example, at bus C. So the numbers I've conveniently calculated for a reason that will come clear later, but you'll have to trust me that PSSC just spat this out, is to show that system normal, essentially what we want to do is just keep stepping up the megawatts or find it until we cause an overload in the system under the maximum and minimum coincident demand. If we want to go beyond that, in this case 48 megawatts, we need to replace a line. There's nothing wrong with replacing a line, but remember it's a cost. Similar to that, under an N-1 condition, we may overload a different line. For example, in this case I've described if A to POC, which is up here as offline, and we go over a certain limit, in this case, which is an output of the studies, we'll need a run-back scheme to prevent line B to C from being overloaded. Since B to C is somewhere else in the network, we can't see it from our connection point, that's a communications run-back scheme. And our important thing we need to share with our developer friend, that's money. And that may be okay, but that's money. So I'm only doing this for the 66 kV connection in the blue, but it's the same process as I described for the orange. Let's go more advanced. I'm going to show some pseudocode. Don't panic. It's all right. So obviously, there is a more advanced way you can do this. You can use real-world SCADA data rather than using a coincident maximum minimum and try and find how that correlates with your actual generation. I'll give you an example. If I just go back here. Let's say the generators at B and C were both wind farms, including the A wind farm as well. If they're all wind farms, it is likely that they are not too heavily correlated with our solar farm we're connecting at S. If B, C, and A are all solar farms, they may be heavily correlated, and therefore there may be more constraints that we need to consider. So this more advanced process is basically fill in your network with your SCADA data that your NSP can provide you if you ask especially nicely, and step your generator up for each time step until you hit a Pmax. Essentially, and what I mean by Pmax is the Pmax you get to will be the limit at which you overload a line. And you can do that under N and N-1 scenarios. And then you will get it's like a distribution of Pmax. And you could take maybe a 1 or 2%, or if you want to think it differently, a 99 or 98% probability of exceedance, and say that seems like a limit where it looks like we can get to the stage where we overload a line. A bit more advanced, but hopefully you can follow it. It's a more accurate. You don't have to necessarily do this step. Remember that you can do this step as long as you want. So I've been talking about costs a lot, and I'm usually try to stay away from costs because costs are very hard to quantify, but this is normally where you and your developer can start working together a bit on, well, okay, how do we decide some of the stuff? So here's some seemingly arbitrary numbers. They're roughly appropriate. Imagine a spreadsheet. We've got P and we've got S, and we step it up in 1 megawatts. If everyone's interested why we're interested in 1 megawatts, it's because integer megawatts is the registered capacity limit. You'll need to have an integer number for AMO. You can't have an intermediate number. And you can calculate how much a solar farm costs. I don't know, let's call it 1.2 million. You can't hold it to me because I haven't told you what currency it's in. And from the extra costs, if we want to do a 66 kV connection, we need to buy a substation. I don't know, 5 million of arbitrary dollars. If we want to do a 220 kV connection, it's going to be a lot more assets. Let's call it 15 million. And then we can step through and identify all the stuff we went through previously, we can quantify those costs. So for example, 53 megawatts and 58.5 MVA, bit of a round number, call it 58. If you recall, was the number I said before was a system normal synchronous condenser. There was a system strength shortfall. We can continue beyond that. Let's just say we're going to put the smallest, cheapest SYNCON we can find, $8 million, some little baby thing, and continue on. So hopefully what you can see we're going to end up with is a graph that looks something like this. Let's assume it's a perfect network. There's no constraints. If that was true, this would be a straight line. I can't think of a network in existence that's like that will have a straight line for power. Can you see where the synchronous condenser is required? Maybe where it jumps up. So we, as power systems engineers or electrical engineers in general, our job is not to typically go into hardcore analysis of project feasibility and benefits cost-wise. But maybe a hint to our clients or to our developer friends is to maybe pick generator size A, maybe not generator size B. Because B, you've just bought a EECON to buy 1 extra MVA of generation. So what I've done on this slide is more for anyone that's been playing along at home and been quickly writing down all the calculations that I go. Here's an example. Now, it's not very interesting because it's a whole bunch of numbers. What is really interesting is converting the previous graph I had to have the 2 different connections on top of each other, granted with some slightly manufactured numbers. So let's consider this as a final output. On the left-hand side of the screen, I have got exactly what I described previously. A straight line with a couple of hips. Whenever we go up, we need an intertrip, and we need a run back, and we need another intertrip, and then a EECON, based on all the things we just calculated. You can see the 2 lines are offset. That was because the 66 kV substation was a lot cheaper to build than the 220 kV substation. So the 2 lines started at that offset. They have the same slope because we're assuming the solar farm cost for the purpose of this essentially is the same. And we can see, interestingly, there is a point and when the 66 kV connection becomes more expensive. What we can also do with our developer friends or someone that's helping them with their financing is you can actually help them to quantify the cost, the revenue associated with that generator. As the generator's Pmax goes up, it will generate more power, generally, assuming it's not curtailed, especially in this generator size. And we know it won't be curtailed because we did all the studies to confirm, at least thermally and system strength, that it's not going to be curtailed. So what we can do is you can convert it into some form of project profitability, whether that be a net present value calculation, internal rate of return, etc., and you get the graph that's up here, with a graph that has certain spikes. As you can see, every time that we end up on those extra costs, the project becomes a little bit more profitable. And we can see here we have found at least a local maxima. In that case, 42 megawatts, or the equivalent, whatever that would be, the equivalent between the 2 generators for Pmax and Smax, would be the most internal rate of return of this project. And 42 is not a round number, but that was calculated based on this. You can also see that should you want to go a lot bigger, 75, 80 MVA seems feasible, but in that case, a 220 kV connection would be a better rate of return for this project. That's all I have. Thank you.